Welcome to the Allison Gary Show with Allison Gary and Melchizedek at Qumran.
All right.
So here's where I put in the applause. The hallelujahs.
Yes. Well, yes, good evening, and thank you all for listening to our series from the book Black Holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls by author Robert Feather. I highly recommend this book and all of the others written by Mr. Feather to those who are seekers of a fuller understanding of some of the possibilities of the historical origins of our faith. This and many other texts are available in PDF format for research to our membership. So if you're interested in pursuing study, consider joining us on our quest, and welcome. Last week, we discussed the possible identity of the teacher of righteousness from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Tonight, we will turn our attention to the figure of Melchizedek as mentioned in the ancient writings. Again, I present the author's opinion only for your consideration. The views aired here may not be those of this ministry or any of our listeners for that matter. Melchizedek is a mysterious figure as presented in the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Talmud. He was an ongoing fascination for the early Christian commentators and Tannaitic rabbis from the 2nd century Common Era onward. All agree that he was of great significance. Much has been written and discussed about this figure, but no one knows with any certainty who he actually was. He first appears in Genesis chapter 14 after the battle of the 4 kings, Raphael, Arioch, Chedorlaomer, and Tidal, and the 5 kings who were presumably Abraham's nephew Lot had been taken hostage, and Abraham came to the rescue with 318 of his armed people. He saved Lot and routed the 4 kings. One of the 5 Canaanite kings, named Melchizedek, praises Abraham. As they divide the spoil of the battle, Abraham seems to offer this king a tithe of the gains. This became the first mention of tithes in Scripture and apparently anticipated the Israelite custom of donating 1/10 of a person's earnings to the temple, even though there was no temple at the time. Significantly, this also implies that Melchizedek was Abraham's superior. Hebrew and Greek sources of the Bible are ambiguous on this concept and show that it could be the other way around, that Melchizedek offers the tithes to Abraham. Abraham did gain the spoils, so it makes more sense that he did the offering, and Hebrews 7 verse 1 through 4 state that Abraham did tithe to Melchizedek. The usual translation of this event calls Melchizedek the king of Salem, with Salem being the site of what becomes Jerusalem sometime later. In Hebrew, the root letters SLM could be read as something else, however, and there is some indication that the letters should be read as shalom or peace. Genesis does describe Melchizedek as the priest of God Most High, giving him sole access to the altar of his temple, which in Deuteronomy 27 verse 6 says must be made of unhewn stone. This implies wholeness and peace, making the ambiguous description of Melchizedek one of a quote-unquote king of peace and then not the king of Salem. Psalm 110, one of the oldest psalms, refers to Melchizedek, though scholars do not agree on its true meaning. They conclude that Melchizedek was not a Jewish priest, but a priest before the priesthood of the Hebrews was begun. There are several Melchizedek references in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 11Q Melchizedek, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, and in the Genesis Apocryphon. He is mentioned by Philo of Alexandria, Josephus, and in the Cairo-Geniza texts, 2nd Enoch, Pseudo-Eupolemus, the Siddur Rabbah, the Gnostic text tractate NHC 9:1, second book of JEU, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, and Pistis Sophia. Dr. Margaret Baker, in her paper on the subject, quote, "Who was Melchizedek and who was his God?" states, "What both the Jewish and Enochic traditions are saying is that the Melchizedek priesthood was the priesthood of Enoch and the generations before the flood. The Book of Jubilees claims that many of the prescriptions of the Torah were far older than Moses and had been given to Noah by his ancestors, the ancient priests." That's from Jubilees 7 and 10. "We cannot just dismiss this as fiction," end of quote. "These are claims to a more ancient religion than that of Moses. This is represented in Scripture by the figure of Melchizedek." The author then questions, quote, "Who was Melchizedek to the Essenes?" His answer is, quote, "He was a composite kingly and priestly figure of Pharaoh Akhenaten and his high priest Merari I," end quote. This person, Melchizedek, was referred to as a human divine figure, but he has not been identified positively. There is much detailed information from Hebrew scriptures and from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so it is surprising that he is still such a mystery. Those who wrote of him had in mind an image of some biblical historical character who was closely related to God. The Qumran Essenes awaited a Messiah who would be embodied by this unidentified figure of Melchizedek, the priest of God Most High, from 11Q Melchizedek, Song of the Sabbath Sacrifice, etc. And although in the New Testament, Yeshua's line of descent is stated as through the Davidic kings, Yeshua is also seen as the heavenly high priest. Yeshua in his person includes all three types of messiahs that the Qumran Essenes waited for: the king, the priest, and the prophet like Moses, as well as the quote-unquote mantle of Melchizedek. To the Qumran community, Melchizedek is a human divine figure who would lead the quote-unquote sons of light in the last eschatological battle and act as a priest to expiate the sins of his followers. This expiation that Melchizedek, as a divine mediator, is to bring is associated with the Day of Atonement. To identify the Melchizedek of Qumran, looking at the attributes linked to this figure from biblical and Qumran texts will bring the picture into focus. He is described as 1. An angel of the Lord who is associated with the divine name. 2. A human figure who is also the quote-unquote Son of God. 3. A human who sits on a divine throne in human form. 4. A mystically elevated human figure who ascends to divine status through 7 heavens and has alternative names of Michael, Metatron, Adoil, Erimiel, Wazir, and or the Son of Man. 5. A visionary figure sitting on a divine throne as seen by Moses. 6. Quote, the name of God, end quote, carried within an angelic human being. 7. The being who is associated with the dazzling heavenly chariot or the Merkabah. 8. In the final eschatological battle, a leader of the, quote, sons of light, end quote, against the forces of darkness who brings an expiation for the sins of humanity and brings a day of atonement. The Hebrew title of Melchizedek can be translated as king, priest, or righteous king. It has a sense of a single person who blends the roles of king and high priest. No one is sure how to explain the origins of this type of concept. The above list of qualifications can point to Egypt and to the Amarna period, however. The roles listed could be embodied in a fusion of King Akhenaten and his high priest Merira. This fusion fulfills all of the characteristics of this, quote, angel of the Lord, end quote. Melchizedek can be the memory of the combined kingly and priestly union of Akhenaten and Merira. Akhenaten, as the pharaohs were seen, was the representative on earth of the high god. Indistinguishable from the high god at times, it is not completely clear who was being worshipped by the people. He perceived himself as God's representative on the earth, though he was a, quote, son of man, end quote. He was also privileged to be the, quote, son of God, end quote. His place in time was to be beside God on a throne. In addition, 7 heavenly stages are the characteristic representation of the route to the eternal heaven in ancient Egyptian mythology. The choice of all these names that seem to derive from Melchizedek is difficult, and there is no full explanation. There may be some association between the rabbinic name Metatron and Aten or Aton. In the Bible, the name of God as Adon or the Lord can be easily matched with the Aten or the Aten and may link to the name Adoel as Adoel. Wazir might relate to the Egyptian name for the vizier, who, as the author maintains, was Joseph in the time of Akhenaten. Additionally, a number of names found in the Merkabah Kabbalistic texts contain the suffix on as well, which was one of the holy cities of the Egyptians. To illustrate the visionary figure seen by Moses, Alan Siegel analyzes a descriptive word in Ezekiel, the tragedian, as having the twofold sense of a, quote, a venerable man, end quote, and a, quote, man of light, end quote. Ezekiel, the tragedian, was a Jewish playwright from the 2nd century BCE who included scriptural history in his works. Fragments of these were found at Nag Hammadi. Akhenaten could be described as a great man whose representation of his god were the physical aspects of light, the Aten figure. The royal figure that Moses saw as a king of Israel makes no sense, as even the first king of Israel, King Saul, came long after Moses. The Nag Hammadi text of Ezekiel the tragedian must have referred to an enthroned figure who preceded Moses. This could only have been a king of Egypt. The Nag Hammadi fragments speak of the throned figure handing Moses a scepter and placing a diadem on his head. These were both features of the kings of Egypt. Moses and Yeshua, central figures of Judaism and Christianity, could both take this mantle of being the, quote, angel of the Lord, end quote, and were apparently seen by the authors of these texts as essential for the Hebrews and the followers of Jesus. The cartouche in hieroglyphs of the name Akhenaten includes the hieroglyph for the name of God, Aten or Aten, A-T-O-N or A-T-E-N, which is a semicircle over a rippling line over an open circle preceded or followed by a feather-like symbol. The modern reading of the enthronement name, Amenhotep IV, did not carry the name of a god, but Akhenaten changed his name to one that did include the name as Akhen, A-K-H-E-N, Aten, A-T-E-N. There is an immense similarity between the descriptions of the heavenly chariot in the Dead Sea Scrolls, incidentally unique to the Essenes, and those found in the tomb of Tutankhamun and seen in reliefs at Amarna. And if you'll bear with me, I have a screen figure for you. Let me find the proper one.
Tongue twisters tonight.
Yes, I'm sorry. Some of these, you can tell I'm an autodidact. I know what the words mean, but I don't know how to pronounce them all the time.
And
So,
those were some very strange books there. That,
yes,
yeah, if you want any of them, if you're listening to this, just let me know. I'll send whichever ones you want. Maybe I'll list them in the show notes too.
that'd be cool. All right, I'm going to share this screen with pictures of the chariot of Tut. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
On the right, see the pharaoh-headed, I suppose that's a lion, and there are others. Let's see if I can get it to move. We'll do it this way. Here's another, hopefully another view. Look at the lion head there. That's on the chariot. And all that gold and those jewels. It's pretty amazing. Let's see, I had another one. There's another picture.
Oh,
That looks like a fox head or something. I don't know what that is. Maybe another lion or a giant.
it
These are
looks like
really,
there's something you would put in the mouth there.
it might be, yes, it might be. I'm not sure what the function of this little piece is.
Maybe a cell phone.
Yeah, that's what's in everybody's face these days. Look at this guy. And this is on the chariot. Let's see if we have any other ones. I think that was,
That says the god Bess or base.
yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I see the caption. I want to make sure I haven't gotten too far off track here. You get checking several pictures and you get a little off track. Let's go back. There's another animal head and another animal head. But this is what can you see how this is all bright gold and jewels and would have flashed and shone in the sun? It's pretty amazing. All right, enough of that one. I've got some others for a little later.
That, by the way, I just ran into the design in the upper right corner
Yes?
with the swirls.
Yes.
And from what I read and saw, that is a sign of the three major gods put together, or in witchcraft, the three goddesses.
I think I've heard that.
Yeah. I don't know if that goes clear back to there. Maybe that's just where they got that.
Could be. All right, we're going to stop share again and get back to my text. The colorful and dramatic pictures of Akhenaten at Amarna riding in his heavenly chariot is unique. There have been no early royal chariots found in Israel, but chariot experiences are strongly represented in Jewish and Christian mystical traditions. There may be no coincidence that the adjectival Hebrew word for atonement, which is atonali, Atonali, contains the root sound Aten or Aten. The English word carries the same root as well. In the city of Aten, the time of atonement was the day when Akhenaten returned as the divine mediator and would celebrate the name of God, whom he called the Aten. Exodus 23 speaks of the angel of the Lord as embodying the name of God as the Tetragrammaton. Melchizedek also incorporates the concept of Akhenaten's high priest mirror. New light has been shed on the New Testament epistle of the Hebrews by the fragmentary 1st century BCE document found in Cave 11 at Qumran, which is known as the Heavenly Prince Melchizedek, 11Q Melchizedek. In Hebrews, the description of Christ as the, quote, Son of God, end of quote, and, quote, without beginning of days or end of life, end of quote, now makes sense as reflecting the same image of Melchizedek as portrayed in the sectarian Dead Sea Scroll. This interpretation was taken further in a paper by Margaret Barker that maintains that Yeshua knew of and understood Melchizedek and that he may have patterned his life on the Qumran conception of Melchizedek, with his followers building on that understanding. In Hebrews, Yeshua is also seen as a, quote, priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek in chapter 5, verse 6. This is the same concept of the high priestly figure from the Qumran texts as the superior priest, suggesting that this priest is Aaron, or Zadok of that lineage, is excluded by the insistence that Yeshua, like Melchizedek, is in the Greek word agenealogetos, Agenealogetos, which means without a genealogy. Professor Joseph Fitzmyer states, quote, every priestly family was supposed to be able to trace its lineage from Levi through Aaron and Zadok. Aaron's lineage itself was known from Exodus 6, verses 16 through 19, but Melchizedek's lineage was unknown, end quote. If, as the author of our book maintains, the name Melchizedek relates to the high priest Merira, he would have been the first of his line, and therefore without any previous priestly lineage. The Melchizedek that Yeshua is said to have emulated, though, shows that this attribution was, quote, not merely of high priesthood, but of royal priesthood, end quote, as explained by Deborah W. Rook. The relationship is spelled out in Hebrews, but there the royal association is assumed to be to King David. Scholars are at a loss to explain why there is no specific Davidic categorization for this royal element. The king specifically mentioned is the king of Salem from the patriarchal period of Abraham, which predated the Israelite kings, and who was a royal figure unrelated to David. It is somewhat of a mire for conventional scholarship. It is crystal clear in Hebrews 14, verse 18, that the Melchizedek that Yeshua is emulating is the king of Salem of Genesis. Quote, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God, end quote. Many scholars note that the Melchizedek of Hebrews can be linked to the Melchizedek of the Qumran scrolls, and that this character is certainly not Davidic. The author asks why an apparently pagan king, the king of Salem, was singled out as a prototype of a divine personage. He is apparently a pagan, and he is not a Hebrew. The answer, the author suggests, lies partly in the Amarna letters, where Jerusalem is singled out by Akhenaten as his holy city forever. In Amarna letter EA 287, Governor Abdi-Heba wrote to Pharaoh Akhenaten and set out his fears for the safety of the city, quote, as the king has placed his name in Jerusalem forever, he cannot abandon it, the land of Jerusalem, end quote. And this is taken from the Amarna letters, edited and translated by William L. Moran, Johns Hopkins University Press, Baltimore and London, 1992. This is the first ever mention of Jerusalem in written texts. Confirmation that the king of Salem in Genesis is a holy king comes from Joshua 10:3, where the king is referred to as Adonai-Zedek, relating him to God as the Aten, or the Adon, and also a high priest. The appellation for King Melchizedek can then be clearly seen as a, I'm not sure what that word is, as a name combining the royal aspect of King Akhenaten and his high priest Merira. If it is seen as a problem that Abraham and Yeshua would be associated with an apparently pagan figure, this can be explained by the fact that Akhenaten and Meriri were not pagan, but, with Jacob and Joseph, the first true monotheists. Abraham acknowledges Melchizedek's God, El Elyon, God Most High, as his own God in their part of the story in Genesis. For Melchizedek to have no ancestors can only mean that he was the first of his class or kind. The literal evidence points in the direction of Merira as the first high priest of Akhenaten's new monotheism, and also that Merira was a hereditary Egyptian prince. Summarizing Melchizedek's characteristics shows that he was not a Hebrew and that he was a high priest of a temple that predated the Jerusalem temple. Point 1. He acknowledged and seemed to believe in the same God that Abraham worshipped, Elyon, or God Most High. 2. He was not, as it is a Hebrew requirement, circumcised. 3. He was a king high priest, and as such would have officiated in a temple, one before the Temple of Jerusalem. Point 4. His name incorporates the role of king and high priest and combined the personalities of two separate people as reflected in the split name Melchizedek or Zadok. 5. He was the first of his line as a high priest, as he was, quote, without a genealogy, end of quote, and preceded Aaron as high priest. The Tannaitic and rabbinic tradition of Melchizedek is from the post-Qumran period when the Romans had scattered the Essenes. The Tannaitic period came after the destruction of the Second Temple and lasted for around 300 years. During this time, the rabbis codified the content of the Hebrew Bible and the Talmud. Leonora Leet, in her study, quote, The Secret Doctrine of the Kabbalah, end quote, looks at the post-Second Temple period and believes that a priestly strain of influence that emanated from the residual Essenes at Qumran had a profound effect on the formulation of the Talmud. These secretive elements also came into the form of Kabbalah. She traces these hidden influences to common origins, which include aspects of Pythagorean geometry and very ancient Egyptian sources. The author thinks her conclusions are correct in that the theme of the, quote, divine son, end of quote, who is also the, quote, son of man, end quote, is an integral part of this mystical teaching. The author also questions, quote, what was the Qumran Essene of the heavenly chariot modeled on? Answer, the heavenly chariot driven by Pharaoh Akhenaten, end quote. As we have mentioned just slightly before, there is no archaeological evidence of chariots in ancient Canaan, but numerous mentions of chariots in during the time of the Hebrew kingdom. Chariots must have been present in Canaan, but there are no good descriptions in the Bible, even though King Solomon was the owner of 1,400 chariots and built chariot towns across Israel. 1 Kings 10, verse 26. The heavenly chariot, as described in the Bible and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is a golden vehicle adorned with gleaming jewels that flashed light in all directions. This is a powerful vision of a divine figure riding in the sky. The reality may be of Egyptian chariots pulled by two stallions with fine trappings and dancing head plumes, such as those seen in Tut's tomb, like I shared on screen share. Cyril Aldred, a great authority on Egypt and Amarna, states, quote, when Akhenaten describes his epiphany at the ceremony of demarcating the city of Akhenaten, quote, mounted in a great chariot of electrum, like the sun god when he rises on the horizon and fills the land with beneficence, end quote. He not only describes the dazzling appearance of such equipages, he reveals how deeply their imagery had entered into Egyptian consciousness, since from time immemorial the gods in Egypt had traveled over the waters of the heavens in ships, end quote. This imagery came from Amarna, the author is certain, considering the closeness of the biblical and Dead Sea Scrolls descriptions to the archaeological knowledge of the kind of royal chariot used by Pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten raised the status of the chariot to that of ceremonial vehicle. It became his symbol of his, quote, going out to the people, end quote, and his showing himself in the state processions. The archaeological finds that the very early followers of Yeshua and even the earlier Essenes discovered when they journeyed to the ruined and destroyed city of Akhenaten. They worshipped in front of a relief of Akhenaten riding his glittering, quote, heavenly chariot. This memory from that time of Akhenaten was the basis for the chariot imagery that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the Bible. The rabbis of later times were reluctant to speak of, quote, heavenly chariots, end quote, due to a conscious or projected fear of having to acknowledge the hidden past and its Egyptian origins. Note that the Egyptian word for chariot, which is WRRT as a root, dating to the 15th century BCE, gave rise to the Hebrew word Merkabah, although I do not know the connection. The earliest forms of Kabbalah are all about the riding of heavenly chariots. The imagery of heavenly chariots must have come from the mystical memory of Akhenaten's fascination with chariots and his passion for parading these glorious and bejeweled conveyances through the streets in grand processions. Then the author asks, quote, why were they awaiting 2 or perhaps 3 messiahs? Answer, they awaited the return of one kingly and one priestly messiah based on their memory of Akhenaten and his high priest Merari I, end quote. The kingly and priestly messiahs are extensively referred to in the Dead Sea Scrolls texts. The surprise is that the persons behind these explicit writings have not been identified by scholars. They are both given various titles in different scrolls. Kingly titles include the Prince of the Congregation, the Scepter, the Messiah of Israel, and the King Messiah. Priestly titles include the Interpreter of the Law, the Star, and the Messiah of Aaron. Additionally, the Qumranites expected the third Messiah to be a prophet like Moses and to return alongside the kingly and priestly messiahs as described in the Community Rules Scroll 1QS 9 and in Deuteronomy 18, verse 5 through 17. The prophet should be a quote-unquote new Moses. This idea is supported by an inclusion of the Deuteronomic passage in the Dead Sea Scrolls known as the Messianic Testimonia found in K4, which is 4Q175. The Qumran Essene texts, when they refer to a kingly Messiah, are taken by scholars to mean someone emerging from the Davidic line of kings. This assumption is loaded with problems and almost certainly wrong. King David, from around 1000 BCE, failed to live up to the righteous ideas demanded by the prophets of the books of Kings and Chronicles, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Micah. David had blood-stained hands and broke almost all of the 10 Commandments. The prophet Nathan condemned David for his evil acts and told him that his descendants would suffer as a result of his murderous deeds. This is not a worthy pattern of a Messiah. Formal messianism in Jewish scripture does not appear until the time of Daniel in the 2nd century BCE, so King David was even less likely to have been the role model for the Qumran writers. So where did they obtain their very detailed descriptions and developed philosophy of these awaited messiahs and messianism? The problem of identifying the kingly and priestly messiahs alluded to in the Hebrew scriptures and spelled out specifically in the Qumran literature is so contentious that scholarship ignores it or tries to find possible candidates on weak evidence. The Pentateuch and succeeding texts in Scripture do not suggest that when the faithful in Israel worshipped at the tabernacle or later in the Jerusalem temple, that they looked to the line of Aaronic priests as a foreshadow of a future high priest Messiah. However, the Qumran Essenes did look for the return of a high priest Messiah. Some scholars, in desperation, seemingly have even suggested that this was Zerubbabel, the rebuilder of the first temple, or Joshua, the high priest, after the return from exile, as candidates. In the author's view, the quote-unquote Davidic line is only an indicator of a longer royal line that predates King David. Or, as a note, as we have studied in past episodes, if you equate David to Tutmos IV and Solomon to Amenhotep III, this would fairly show that it was an older line. In fact, most texts referring to the Messianic king deliberately do not lead to a Davidic figure. Many of the motifs of a future king can be taken from Israel's experience of kings. Other motifs can be traced to earlier periods of Israel's history. King David could not be the personification of the quote-unquote suffering servant of Yahweh who is frustrated in his ambitions and killed for his efforts as a messianic figure, as referenced in Isaiah, Zechariah, and Dead Sea Scrolls 4Q285. None of those characteristics can be applied to King David. Qumran scholars have offered that references to a Messiah of Israel by the Qumran sectarians should be regarded as non-Davidic. When there is a reference to a kingly line, this is a memory of a different line of royalty. As there is no reference to Jerusalem in the Jerusalem scroll, a Davidic Messiah does not appear in the sectarian scrolls. The limited and ambiguous references haven't prevented scholars from falling back on the Davidic model, but there are alternative explanations. There are many clues in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The rule of the community 1QS refers to, quote, a Messiah begotten by God, end of quote, and this cannot refer to Jesus. In its context with the other references to messiahs, it had to be a previously existing person, previous to the writing. The author believes that it was none other than the monotheistic king Akhenaten, the, quote, son of God, end quote, to the Egyptians. The phrase occurs in column 2, lines 11 through 12, and the author has been able to verify the interpretation of, quote, Messiah begotten by God, end quote. One of the most controversial of the sectarian writings referring to a Messiah is in Dead Sea Scrolls 4Q285, fragment 5, and to the prince of the congregation as being a suffering and executed Messiah. This Messiah has been equated with Christ by some sensationalists, quote, as it is written in the book of Isaiah the prophet, the thickets of the forest will be cut down with an axe, and Lebanon by a majestic one will fall. And there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and then there's the lacuna, the branch of David, and they will enter into judgment with another lacuna, and the prince of the congregation. The branch of David will kill him by strokes and by wounds. And a priest, this is of renown, will command the slain of the Kittim, end quote. In the opinion of Giza Vermes, the reference here is not to be related to a contemporary Jesus, but it is a reference back to the Messiah of Isaiah, quote, and he shall cut down the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon shall fall by a mighty one, end quote. Isaiah 10:34. This explanation only deals with half of the picture, nor have many other obvious questions been approached by the great number of scholars. Some commentators speculate that the Dead Sea Scrolls passage refers to Yeshua, but clearly the Qumran Essenes were not writing of a contemporary experience of Yeshua. They were looking back to a royal Messiah and a priestly Messiah whose descendants would bring the word of God, not just to the elite few, but to the wider community. All ideas from the Dead Sea Scrolls of messiahs need to explain where these messianic figures originated, as well as to answer various questions. To sum this up, the author presents some further questions and answers. Excuse me. 1. Who were the royal and priestly messianic figures that the Qumran, Essenes, and Isaiah refer to? His answer is the original two messianic figures who were awaited by the community were King Akhenaten and the high priest Merira, as we said. 2. Why were the royal and priestly messianic figures called the scepter and the star? Answer. The two messianic figures in the Dead Sea Scrolls were the scepter and the star because the sign of the royal position of Pharaoh Akhenaten was a scepter. When the pharaohs died, they became a star.
Wow.
In Egypt. Yes. I think I spoke about that several weeks ago, perhaps. The invisible God that both Akhenaten and Meriri worshipped was shown in many inscriptions in Amarna as, quote, the Aten, a sun disk, which is the brightest symbol of light known to mankind. In the Cairo-Damascus document and the Dead Sea Scroll fragments from Cave 5, I think 5, I believe. Wait. Cave 4, sorry.
4.
In Qumran, there's a clear reference to a, quote, star Messiah who equates to the Messianic interpreter of the law and prince of the congregation. This Messiah relates to the time of Jacob, who the author dates to the time of Akhenaten. Quote, a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, end quote. This wording is also in Numbers 24:17, but in the Cairo-Damascus document, the star as the interpreter of the law is used to describe a figure who comes to Damascus. Barbara Thiering identifies this Damascus as Qumran. The significance of this journey will be discussed later in the author's book, but it has been suggested that when the teacher of righteousness fled into exile, another of his followers fled in a different direction, that of Damascus. 3. Why was the priestly messianic figure often referred to as prince of the congregation and also designated as a hereditary prince? The priestly messianic figure was named a hereditary prince because the high priest Merira was a prince by birth, just as he is referred to in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Shabti figurine in the Metropolitan Museum, mentioned previously, has robes and accoutrements similar to those robes and accoutrements worn by the high priests in the Jerusalem temple. The objects held by Merira are the Urim and Thummim, as described in Exodus 28, Leviticus 8:8, and elsewhere in Scripture. The Shabti is made from blue serpentine stone, just as the descriptions in Exodus and Leviticus required, quote, and thou shalt make the robe of the ephod all of the blue, end quote, Exodus 29:31. 4. Why were there constant associations of the messiahs to light and the stretching out of hands for a bread offering? Answer. The image of a messiah who, quote, will extend his hands to the bread offering, end quote, as is described in the Messianic rule of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is reminiscent of the extended hands of Akhenaten offering bread to the Aten. And if you'll bear with me, I have a fairly good representation of that, once again from Google Images. Just have to find it. Oh,
this is absolutely revolutionary stuff.
Look at this picture here to the right of the screen. Can you see the bread loaves in Akhenaten's hands, offering them to the Aten?
That's like Pentecost, the two loaves.
And there's more loaves here, yes. Exactly like Pentecost or Shavuot, like we did this past June. Pretty neat. All right, enough of that one. Let me put this screen back. So, this gesture is a dominant theme in many reliefs found in Akhenaten. The vision of the extending hands of the Aten giving life, light, and sustenance is found there as well. In the Manual of Discipline or the Community Rule, there's a description of a last meal before the Messiah comes. This Essene ritual meal is attended by 10 men and presided over by a Messiah in a manner reminiscent of the Last Supper style in Christian scripture in Matthew 26,
It sure is.
Mark 14, Luke 22, and 1 Corinthians 11. Quote, "For he shall bless the first portion of the bread and the wine, and shall extend his hand to the bread first. Afterwards, the Messiah of Israel shall extend his hands to the bread. Afterwards, all of the congregation of the community shall bless each according to his importance." And that's from one of the fragments, but I don't have.
Yeah, it's from the Messianic
rule?
banquet fragment.
Right.
I wanted to mention that the he in the beginning of that quote is the priest. So
Priestly Messiah.
even the kingly Messiah can't touch those loaves until
Pretty
the
cool.
priest does.
That also goes back to the practices in the temple and also in the temple of the Aten. It's interesting.
And to the church today. The
Yeah.
sacramental church anyway.
True. It's pretty neat how some things just click.
Almost scary. I wonder, is this kind of teaching going to be rejected just out of hand, or are we going to get labeled, as we have in the past at times, for being dangerous heretics or cultists?
Quite possibly.
The truth is what's the most important, and there's too much.
And there's a reason
here.
We may actually, if I remember where it is in this teaching, we may actually get to one of the points that I think has come from all of this study. So let me hope I find it.
Right.
So question 5 was, why did Isaiah, who lived in circa 740 BCE, prophesy that the tasks that Yahweh would perform at the time of the reconstituted Messiah include recovery of remnants of his people from Egypt and Cush, which is Nubia? Answer. A related question is, why, when the Messiahs arrived, was their first task to deal with evil in Egypt? This is the link I'm talking about. This issue is confirmed in the Cairo-Damascus text, and it also confirms the Messiah's connection to Akhenaten. The first task stated in the Cairo-Damascus documents for the star Messiah to perform is not to restore the temple, not to revive the dead, cure the sick, bring peace to the world, attend to Judea's problems, or even get rid of the Romans. It is to attend to issues in Egypt and destroy Seth. Quote, "And when he comes, he shall smite all the children of Seth," end quote. Any question that this is about anything other than an Egyptian-related Seth is removed by a quote in the Dead Sea Scroll relating to Ezekiel. Quote, "And I will slay the wicked in Memphis, and I will bring my sons out of Memphis and turn favorably toward the remnant," end quote. That's 4Q 386 for you sleuths and scholars.
Oh, I've heard so many talk about that passage as being the sons of Seth, being the grandchildren of Adam and that bunch. And you wonder, they theorize that Melchizedek is Sethian. So that absolutely makes no sense at all.
Well, the author has a couple of more points on this. It's interesting.
Right.
He says, no, that's all right. Please bring up anything that is relevant. So his question is, why Seth and Memphis? The conventional view would deal with the obscure third son of Adam, that's Seth. The real target is the traditional enemy of Akhenaten's monotheism, the most powerful Egyptian god of evil and chaos, that's Seth. Memphis was a center of theology in Akhenaten's day and an administrative hub. The first Aten temple was built there, and the city reverted to paganism after the pharaoh left the throne. This is a case of settling old scores in Egypt, not Israel, according to the author. The Qumran Essenes held a view on the origins of evil and, quote, the children of Seth, end of quote. Dead Sea Scrolls 4Q 417 Professor John Collins expresses the idea of Seth as a, quote, evil inclination, end quote, derived from a, quote, myth of cosmic conflict, end of quote. It is a story relating to legendary spiritual forces, not of human beings. And I might add, very Enochian.
Yeah.
In terms of Christianity, equating Adam's Seth with evil is heresy. Luke chapter 3 lists Yeshua's family tree fully back to Adam as the son of Yahweh, with his second ancestor being Seth. So it would be heresy to say that an ancestor of Yeshua's was evil. So, question 6. Why would the new Messiah want a wider audience of, quote, unquote, the people rather than just a special few? Answer. A principle of Akhenaten's new religion was that it was open to all people. Secretive worship in hidden parts of temples was not promoted. The great temple was mainly open to the skies and had a huge court to allow access to thousands of people. Question 7. Why was the return of the Messiahs linked to an apocalyptic age that would herald the reestablishment of the kingdom of Yahweh? And what triggered this eschatology? Answer. The earlier apocalypse was recognized as the end of Akhenaten's rule and the destruction of his holy city. It was hoped that the returning messiahs would restore the city, deal with evil in Egypt first, and restore the boundaries of that holy city. The imminent anticipation of this golden age was predicted from the texts of Enoch, Ezekiel, and Daniel, plus other prophetic writings. Question 8. Why had the figure of the royal Messiah suffered and been killed? Answer. The Qumran Essenes believed that Akhenaten had been wrongfully deposed and killed by his enemies. Question 9. Sorry. The Qumran... wait, I forgot to put a number in here. All right, there we go. Question 9. Why was the community following a different form of Judaism from the normal population? Answer. Qumran followed the basic laws of the Pentateuch as underscored by the religious philosophy and practices of Akhenaten's monotheism. Question 10. Why did they follow a solar calendar when the temple priest followed a lunar solar calendar? Answer. The solar calendar had been used at Akhenaten. The new festivals that are spelled out in the temple scroll match the listings in the great hymn to the Aten, as well as the sequence in Psalm 104. There is even a lulav depicted in a ceremony engraved at the great temple. Many of the scrolls and a sundial found at Qumran show their adherence to a solar calendar. Their festivals always fell on a fixed day, with Passover and the New Year always falling on a Wednesday, or our Wednesday. A study by Professor James Vanderkam uses the latest available translated material from Qumran and concludes that the scrolls definitely assign the use of the solar calendar to a very early pre-Babylonian influence period dating back to at least the time of King David, or possibly Tutmosis IV, if you take that as an identifier of King David. Question 11. Why do the Dead Sea Scrolls refer to the appointment of priests in the time of Jacob and Joseph in a temple context in a time before there was even a tabernacle in Sinai? Answer. Priests were appointed to the great temple at Akhenaten. Jacob and Joseph witnessed these events. Inscriptions show that Joseph was almost certainly involved in religious ceremonies in the great temple, and a bound scroll was paraded in the place of worship, just as it is today in synagogues. It is also depicted as having been decorated with pomegranates as well, just like it is today. Question 12. Why did they not celebrate Purim in Qumran? Answer. Yahweh is not the central theme of the book of Esther, for one thing. Plus, there are no traces of the book of Esther found at Qumran. They also did not celebrate Hanukkah. The conventional explanation is that Yahweh is also not a major force described in the Maccabean recapture of the Second Temple.
Yeah.
A more plausible reason is the antagonisms shown in 1st and 2nd Maccabees towards Onias IV, who was the Essene's teacher of righteousness, according to this author. No fragments of any of the 6 books of the Maccabees have been found there. Also, if Essenism was a large influence in early rabbinic Judaism, as the author maintains, it is not surprising to find no texts that are derogatory to their teacher at Qumran.
Amazing. That's like the showstopper right there.
It's pretty
My
good.
goodness. Yeah, in fact, Esther doesn't have the name in there any place. One of the very few books that also would certainly explain why Maccabees, a very, very popular book, never found there. Not a bit of it. Ah, that's amazing. Thank you.
I've got one little bit to finish here.
Please
3 more
continue.
questions.
This
Okay.
is very exciting.
I'll make sure. All right. Question 13. Why did Qumran Essenes denigrate the temple at Jerusalem? Answer. They hated the practices and design of the Jerusalem temple and venerated the memory of the plan of the temple at Akhenaten. Many of their texts show their preference for the tabernacle to the Jerusalem temple. The number of courts of the Jerusalem temple were wrong, the ceremonies inappropriate, the furnishings incorrect, and the officiating priests were unholy. They refused to pray in or enter the Jerusalem temple. When Onias IV, their teacher of righteousness, built his temple in Leontopolis in Egypt, he modeled it on the proportions of the great temple at Akhenaten and installed a huge golden globe instead of a menorah in an apparent attempt to represent the Aten sun symbol.
You can't emphasize that enough, because the true temple of Yahweh was in Egypt for 250 years. No menorah, but the circular disc that represented the Aten.
Yes.
Wow.
So we have 2 more. Why was the largest room or prayer hall at Qumran built in an almost exact geographic alignment with the great temple at Akhenaten? The author's answer, this should be remarkable in and of itself. And our last question, and the end of my review on this book, which I do highly recommend that you read yourselves. It's full of all sorts of really good tidbits. The question is, why is the name of the high priest at Akhenaten mentioned in the war scroll as a leader of the forces of light in the war against the sons of darkness? The answer, Merere, I'll spell it, M-E-R-E-R-E, Meriri, M-E-R-I-R-I, or Merire, M-E-R-Y-R-E, of the war scroll. This name is not found in the scriptures, in the Bible, the canonical scriptures. There is little in Hebrew scriptures about a future priest as well. The author thinks that the name Merira or Merwera was the title for a leader of the Qumran community that reflected this priestly connection.
Honestly, that name is interpolated into the genealogies of the kings. Interpolated, along with a few other names, like Zadok is interpolated in there, for the simple reason of this kind of research. We can't leave them out. We can't leave Merari out. He said, can't remember exactly, maybe one of the sons or grandsons of Yehuda?
Yes, something in there.
Right? Something
yes,
like that.
We touched on that a couple of weeks ago, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and there are all sorts of connections all throughout this. I don't know if there's another reason besides what everyone says that it's embarrassing to Israel to have this Egyptian connection. There must be something else, but that in and of itself is pretty strong. So, for what it's worth.
And you think that Yahweh, in his words through the prophets, would not be saying the things, especially in Isaiah, about Egypt in such a good light.
Yes.
That in the end, Egypt is going to be saved, if I can use that term. I think that's Isaiah chapter 19, but
I think
all
you're
throughout.
right.
You know, one minute there's cursing of Egypt, and the next minute there's salvation of Egypt. So unless it's already been fulfilled, we should see something happen there that turns those people's hearts back to Yahweh. Oh, maybe I can get an interview with that missionary who lived in Egypt and evangelized in the
Oh, yes.
Muslims there,
Yes.
who had such an incredible story about how they took to the Messianic idea that it was put forth in the New Testament.
That would be,
I'm going to try again.
that'd be great. Wow.
He never said no. He just would never say.
Well, that's a good way of saying no, but, you know, it's polite. But maybe you can get him. All right, I have about another little paragraph, and then we'll be done. All right, so we have the war scroll stating, quote, "And on the banner of Merari they shall write God's offerings and the name of the prince of Merari." That's 4QM. He thinks that the author thinks that a line of priestly heirs may have been preserved along with some of their original knowledge and secrets from the time of Akhenaten. The persecution of these ancestors was attested to in a pseudepigraphic, sorry, I'm terrible with that word.
Pseudepigraphic.
Thank you. Psalm of Joshua, which appends a description of the Messiah of the future. This psalm is about the Joshua who succeeded Moses as the Hebrew leader circa 1200 BCE, before Israel had a king or a high priest, but this fragmentary scroll text speaks in the past tense of events related to a king and a high priest who were connected with the persecutors of the sect and the destruction of the holy city. That points directly to Akhenaten and Merari. And the quote at the very end of this is, "Cursed be the men who rebuild this city," end quote. 4Q Testimonia, which is also the Florilegium, and also from 4Q 175. So, thus endeth the lesson.
Oh, I'm telling you, if this wasn't such a deep and difficult subject to get a hold of, mainly because we're jaded, we already have our historical religion and its texts, then this would be revolutionary. It wouldn't change much.
No.
But it would certainly give us a much deeper understanding of the roots of the faith, even up to the time of Abraham. We would get so much more insight. I don't know what to do to make this more available to people except to have them buy and read this book. But I'll be honest with you, it's not an easy book to understand.
No, unless you already understand a lot of things, and not scriptural things necessarily, historical things. Yeah. It won't mean much to you unless you're a Qumran buff or a Dead Sea Scrolls buff. But what I see as the whole message here is the importance of this historical position for Christians to understand that the religion of the Hebrews is not something that is so exclusive to them alone. It is theirs. But originally, if it came from more than one source and it included more than one people, how great is it going to be in the time when the kingdom comes for all of us?
Absolutely. And I was reading a book by a preterist today. It's a good book. But in that book, there are a number of pages dedicated to showing that the Hebrew religion and history really needs to be dumped. Because 70 AD, they say, that was the end of the temple, that was the end of the Old Testament, that was the end of the covenant, that was the end of the Torah. And I certainly, even through his lengthy arguments on this, I couldn't get that. But where he was coming from was, of course, his understanding of the Apostle Paul.
Yes.
And it was heavy in Pauline theology and his perspective of history, which makes me more suspicious about whether Paul was supposed to be in this line or wasn't. I don't want to cut Paul out. You know, he's got a lot of good stuff we need, but at the same time, he absolutely ignores not only these things, which he should and probably does know, but he ignores Yahshua HaMashiach entirely.
Yes.
And when he talks of Yahshua, he's not talking about a historical man. He's talking about, well, as he said, a life-giving spirit.
Yes. He's talking about the Yeshua that he saw in his vision. Mm-hmm. He never met him. He didn't really hold much truck with his family in Jerusalem, you know?
Who says the devil can appear as an angel of light?
Correct.
Even on the Damascus Road.
Yes.
Well, I know we won't be popular for this, but no, we haven't dumped Paul. We don't hate Paul. We're just a little suspicious. That's all.
Did you see the latest? There was an article on Paul in Biblical Archaeological Review that was a free download book that you could read that has several different views of how Paul saw the law. It was fairly interesting. I might see if I can steal it and put it up in our Facebook group.
This latest issue?
I think I got it. I just joined it, so I got several dozen emails from them with different offers.
And that
but
was
I'll see if I can find
e-book. Just give us the name of that. I'm sure that I have it.
Hold on.
Or it's in the library. I can dig it out.
It is called Paul, Jewish Law, and Early Christianity. It's about 40 pages long.
And it's a collection of articles from different people?
Yes, and it's the Biblical Archaeology Society from 2012.
Well, I probably have that on CD or in the magazine or a video or something. No, even N.T. Wright, a conservative, real scholar, has written extensively on Paul's position as the founder of Christianity. And look, this guy is beloved everywhere, and people listen to him. Of course, he sugarcoats it, but that's exactly what he's saying. When we're looking at founders of Christianity, the founder is Paul. Well, if you're on here listening and you want further knowledge on Paul especially, I have it for you. I have a whole collection on the things about Paul that we don't read in the scripture, that come from tradition or actual secular history of the time or primary sources. And that's an eye-opener. It's an eye-opener. You've heard them all, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. My favorite epiphany was Paul as a Herodian.
Mm-hmm. That came from Robert Eisenman.
Yes.
In one of his books, Qumran in Christianity or something like that. But yes, we've got that too. If anybody wants to dig more into this, we've got all these books in PDF form, and we'll be happy to lend them to you, as Allison said earlier. Well, that was tremendous. Wow. I'm excited and also a little bit dismayed.
The end of a good book to read
Oh,
and to review.
absolutely. Great book. And, I think what you can do if you really want to get into this is read his series of 3 books: Copper Scroll,
The Secret
Secret
Initiation.
Initiation, and Black Holes in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this
Yeah.
guy, he gets no attention paid at all because he is, by trade, a metallurgist and not a university trained biblical exegete on the old boys list.
Right.
Okay. Thank you, Allison. That was tremendous.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I almost hate to see this end up, it's just you and me, sister.
Yep.
Uh huh. And all the people that are going to listen to this, I was thinking this week, these podcasts and YouTube videos could be on for the next 100 years.
Oh, yes. If
We're
it's
all
on the
around.
internet, it never goes away.
That's right. And you've got a good following out there in this particular series, I'm happy to say. So up it goes. End of the
Right.
series. Let's cry. Have a glass of wine, a piece of cheese, a morsel of bread.
Yes.
Thank you. Catch you next time tomorrow night.
Yep.
All right.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.